When I graduated from college, I moved to Harlem. I lived there by myself for 2 years, first on 125th and Park, and second a little bit farther east. At the time, my friends, my family, my colleagues, just about everybody would ask me, why do you live in Harlem? And sometimes I think that they were thinking, why do you live in a place that's so dangerous and inhospitable? And sometimes I think people were thinking, why do you live someplace that you don't belong? Why are you gentrifying this neighborhood? Why are you coming in as an outsider? So clearly this is a thing that people have different feelings about. And while I've reflected a lot on this time, this really formative time in my life, while I've thought about it a bunch, I haven't shared much about it, partly because I think so many people just have different assumptions about what the place is like, what it would be like to live there, whether you should live there, all this stuff. Today, I want to just reflect as honestly as I can about this extremely complicated and interesting time in my life. I've already tried to record this video once, but I became too emotional to continue, so hopefully this time I can get through it. I remember the first time that I ever came to Harlem. The first thing I saw, my first memory of it, is coming up out of the subway on 125th and Lexington, 456, and looking down, looking west, and seeing the sort of goofy, like Art Deco-ish, like weird mural thing that's on the Metro North train tracks that run above ground across 125th. And I actually moved to Harlem because of that Metro North station, but I'll tell you exactly why I was there in a little bit. My first impression was that it felt like a different country. It reminded me of when I'd gone to Nicaragua in high school. Some of the little traveling I did in my life, one of the few trips I took was to Nicaragua. And I remember coming out of the airport doors there and just being hit by like this wall of humidity. And I came to Harlem for the first time in the summer. And I mean, I'd been outside elsewhere in New York, but it felt a little bit different up there. And coming out, yeah, I got this feeling that it was just a place unlike anything else I had ever seen. You know, you'd walk down the sidewalk and the sidewalks are crowded with people selling all this stuff on stands, tons of phone cases, people selling phone cases, but also people selling, bootleg DVDs, of course, and then people selling like tubs, like yogurt containers full of, I don't know what, honestly, to this day, I'm not really sure, but it's pretty common to see people selling something. I remember realizing that the economy there is probably the second main thing I realized was that the economy functioned differently. And partly they'd be like, you'd walk past stores and they would say, EBT accepted here. I didn't exactly know what that was. I thought something like food stamps, maybe, I don't know. There was a furniture store pretty close to my apartment, and it said financing available. And it had never exactly occurred to me that you might buy a couch using like some sort of financing. I grew up not in a wealthy family at all, in a very middle-class family on the other side of the country. Maybe I'll get into that a little bit more later on, but this was something totally different to me. The economy worked differently. There were stores I'd never heard of before. Jimmy Jazz, for instance. There was a place called Rainbow Outlet. This was a store that was going out of business for like 5 months, 6 months. They always had, huge sale, going out of business. Come on, 90% off. And I thought, a scam. Eventually, though, that particular Rainbow Outlet actually did go out of business. I was shocked. But whether or not it was related to their going out of business sale or not, who knows? But they did go out of business, or they closed that location. I don't know. Of course, there's a ton of barbershops, hair braiding places. I remember I didn't typically walk around a lot late at night. I'll talk more about that later. But I remember sometimes I'd be coming back from a concert or something. I'd be walking down the street at like midnight, and the barbershop would be open, and some guy would be getting a haircut, and there'd be like, 10, 15 people hanging out in the barbershop in the middle of the night. There's a wig supply store right next to my apartment, like right across the street. There's a wig shop. And I lived in Harlem during the pandemic, which is going to be a huge part of this story. And I remember for a long time, a lot of stuff was shut down, but eventually this wig store opened up and there was a line down the block for the wig shop. I couldn't understand at all why at the time. Before I get too deep into this, let me share a little bit more information about why I actually was there, why I lived in Harlem. Obviously, I had some idea what it would be like, and that's not to make things sound particularly foreboding or whatever, but I did have some idea what the score would be, and this is, I think, common in life, that you kind of know what things will be like, but also you can't picture them at all, and there's always so much stuff to learn that you can only really learn by being on the ground and doing stuff. The reason that I ended up there was relatively simple. I got a job that was in Westchester County, which is north of New York City, if you're not familiar. And I, for a long time, was going back and forth on whether or not I wanted to live in one of the towns to the north of New York City, maybe live near Mohegan Lake or something and get a car and drive to the office. Or I might be able to live in White Plains and take a shuttle to the office. Or another option was to live in the city somewhere and take the Metro North. And at the time, this seemed like an intractable decision. Now it seems pretty obvious that it was the right choice to live in New York City. And when I first looked at the map, I thought, well, the Metro North stops in two places in New York. It stops at 125th, and it stops at Grand Central. And Grand Central is 15 minutes more on the train, so if you're doing that both directions, that means your commute is half an hour longer. So I chose to live near 125th, thinking that it was sort of the perfect compromise for being in the city, but also being able to get to the train. And whether or not that exactly panned out, maybe I'll come back to it. My life was really centered around the commute, though. That isn't to say that I didn't spend time out and about. People say sometimes that one of the reasons you don't need a big apartment in New York is that you're never there. You never go out, or you always go out. And it's true, sometimes you see apartment tours where people in an apartment barely has a kitchen, and you wonder, how is this possible? Well, the reason is because a lot of people in the city eat out truly for every meal. That wasn't the case for me. And remember, I lived there during the pandemic, so I ended up spending a lot of time in this apartment and a lot of time in that neighborhood. Fortunately, my apartment was actually pretty nice, partly because it was so far north. There was plenty of room for activities, more or less. Anyway, the commute, like I said, was sort of the center of my life. Every day, I lived so close to the Metro North station that the longest part of my commute was actually inside of my office building to get to my office. I would walk about 200 yards to the station. I'd get on the train, then a shuttle would pick us up, drop us off right in front of the door of the office. I sort of got to know a little bit the other people riding on the train. I didn't actually talk to them or meet them, but there was this association you got with your other frequent commuters. I was a reverse commuter, and there were some other people there, a number of people who worked at Regeneron, which is in Tarrytown, I think, and I would see them every day. And then when the pandemic happened, these people kind of got completely cut out of my life. I went to explore Harlem. The first time I ever saw it was when I was trying to decide where I should live. And it was actually right after I had graduated from college. I went to college in Philadelphia, or outside of Philadelphia. And my parents, after graduation, we took my stuff and we drove up to New York and we put it in a storage container in New Rochelle, New York of all places. New Rochelle, the setting of the Dick Van Dyke Show. Anyway, we after we put my stuff in this storage place, we wandered around. We looked at White Plains and we looked at Harlem. And then when I came back, after I'd sort of decided that Harlem was the place for me, or really that White Plains was not the place for me, I had maybe 3 days between landing in New York and when I probably needed to have an apartment to live in to start my job. Now, fortunately in New York, no problemo to get an apartment in 3 days. So that wasn't bad at all. It was interesting to explore some of the different places. One thing that I overlooked a little bit when I was looking around at these places, looking at the neighborhoods, was that I was there during the day. And it turns out that some neighborhoods, and especially Harlem, actually, can be very different in the day and at night. And that's not exactly, maybe it's not quite what you would expect. I'm not saying that, in the night it's so dangerous, but during the day it's great. One thing that happens during the day is that there's, fewer of the people who are going off to their jobs are around. And so it sort of will accentuate in some ways, like the local homeless population, things like that. So in some ways, being there during the workday is not one of the nicer times to be there. But anyway, that skewed a little bit my perception of it. But nonetheless, I found an apartment, moved in. I'm not going to go into the details of that stuff. I have a ton of New York apartment stories. Maybe that's for another video. If people can tolerate this diversion from the usual subject of the channel, which is film. But anyway, I eventually moved in. Shout out to this guy, Oliver, who's the broker who represented the building, Danish guy. Great guy. I moved in and I sort of settled into this life, commuting every day. And at the time, it was my first job out of college, and I was highly, highly motivated. I felt like I could have broken through a brick wall at the time. So I knew that nothing was really going to get in my way. But also, it was a big change. It was the first time I'd really lived on my own for an extended period of time. I had other friends in the city, and I tried to convince some of them to live in Harlem with me, but none of them wanted to. Um, anyway, as I sort of settled in, I got to know the area some. I'm not going to do this all chronologically because, frankly, it's a little hard for me to remember when all the different pieces happened. But I remember, I mean, there were a lot of moments that really stuck with me from that early period when I first moved in. I remember, for instance, when I would take the train home, there was somebody who would set off the alarm in the station every day. There was one door that said, "Do not exit here," or the alarm will sound. And every day, somebody on my train would set it off, and I spent quite a while trying to sleuth out who it was. It turned out eventually it was a nurse, and I think she may be caught on to the fact that I was surveilling her a little bit because she stopped doing it. But I remember thinking that was just a fun piece of the chaos at that station. I remember one day walking down the street, and I was walking behind a woman, and there was a garbage truck going down the street, and the garbage truck slowed down, and it like stopped right sort of by this woman, and the garbage man leaned out of the truck and said, "You look beautiful today." And then they drove off, and the woman kind of smiled or whatever. Of course, I grew up in a progressive place where catcalling should be penalized by death, I think, is the general idea. And I'm not sure that everybody felt the same way about it in Harlem. That's not to say, I don't know what that's to say, but there were a lot of cultural differences that you would pick up on. Parenting styles, completely different. It wasn't uncommon to hear parents in a store or on the street really berating their children in a way that wouldn't have been as common where I grew up. And there's not a lot that I can say about these things. There were things that were different culturally, I guess. People would go down the street with their stereos blasting. People would walk down the street with a boombox and like listening to music. I remember when I was in college, there was a student there. I can't remember if he was from New York. I think he was, who would walk like into the dining hall with his speakers playing. And at the time, I thought, why would you do that? That's so like inconsiderate. When I moved to Harlem, I realized that a lot of people do that kind of thing all the time. Now, that's not to say that I endorse this exactly, but it's more common. I remember I lived on 125th. If you go there now, actually, you'll see on the corner of 125th and Park, there's a huge empty lot. I lived across the street from that empty lot. If you look over this lot from the train, you'll see the New York School of Podiatry is sort of on one side of this lot. An iconic Metro-North sort of landmark when you're looking at the old New York School of Podiatry. There's this empty lot. There's a fence around it, and now there's murals all around this fence that are really cool. When I moved there, they weren't there, and I remember looking out my window and watching the first version of those being painted, and it was cool to see the artwork go up there. There was what's it called? A CSA? No, like a farm sharing FSA, whatever that's called when there's some farm or whatever that distributes produce or something like that. There was something like that would happen on that corner. A lot of cool little local stuff. I remember the first time, my first 4th of July there, seeing the fireworks all over the place. People setting off fireworks in the street was crazy. Actually, I remember during the 4th of July in the pandemic, I guess, which, that checks out. We would have been in quarantine. That summer, for whatever reason, there was a huge amount of fireworks that were going off all over the place in the city. I don't know if you remember this, if you were around, but I even heard some rumors that it was like a psyop from Russia or China to distribute more fireworks in the cities to disgruntled people. I strongly doubt that was the case. I think people were just cooped up and wanted to let off some steam. Either way, I lived on the 7th floor or something like that, and I would look out my window on the average night in July or something, and every 30 seconds you'd see fireworks going off from somewhere. It was kind of wild. And then you go out on the street, like on the actual 4th of July, and you had to really watch your step because people were setting things off left, right, and center with sometimes minimal regard for safety. I remember my second apartment was near Thomas Jefferson Park. I remember going to watch some sort of basketball league that was happening there. I think these were high school-aged people, maybe. I don't think they were even juniors or seniors. I'm not really sure. But anyway, these kids were dunking. I remember this league, they had a DJ and a commentator, and the commentator would like be on the court during the game. Somebody would miss a shot, and he'd be like, "Oh, come on, man, how'd you miss that? That was an easy one." He'd be like roasting the players during the game, running onto the court in mid-game. They had sound effects too. Somebody would hit the rim, and it'd be like a big boing sound effect they would play or whatever. This was sort of during the pandemic too, and a huge gathering of people. And I remember cops hanging out right alongside all of them. I'll get into the whole pandemic dynamic soon. I mean, that was interesting. I remember the marathon coming through Harlem. This was before the pandemic. The marathon is one of the things that unites New York City more than anything else. And in Harlem, it was really a great scene. Tons of people out there. I remember because I lived in between the route of the marathon and the subway station, so I would see people running down the street with their signs going to support somebody in the marathon, and then 20 minutes later they'd come back running back the other direction to go catch the train again to meet up with their friend at some other checkpoint or something. I remember for the marathon they had some sort of MC. They had a bunch of stages, a bunch of bands playing like music, and they had MCs every so often cheering on the crowd, basically. I mean, in most neighborhoods, people are cheering on the crowd, but in Harlem, at least the MC I saw was just absolutely roasting everybody who went by, making fun of them. Oh, you can't be tired already, things like this. It was good stuff. I think one of my favorite things about living in Harlem was just seeing the community itself. Now, this was not a community that I ever felt in any way a part of, but just seeing how, and I mean, this is true in lots of places of New York, but just seeing people living their lives, seeing the community itself, seeing people out on their steps with their family, just hanging out, right? Seeing people bump into each other on the street, people who knew each other. I remember a couple times seeing people see each other from across 125th, which is a big street. Some guys walking on this side, some guys walking on this. He says, "Hey, man." And they're shouting to each other from across 125th. Of course, some people just walk across 125th in the middle of the street. Don't know why. Seeing the community was cool. I live pretty close to Marcus Garvey Park, and that was a place where it really felt, like a community. I think on a deeper level, I remember thinking that Harlem was just an extremely beautiful place. And I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of places in New York are extremely beautiful, but Harlem has something to it in particular. The streets there, I think, they seem really wide, for one thing, the avenues, partly because the sidewalks are actually a little bit wider there. There's the setbacks there are a little bit bigger. But also just because the types of buildings that are there is a little bit different, so it doesn't feel quite as crowded as a place like Midtown. For instance, the townhouses, they're like beautiful buildings, but also a lot of, I don't know, I always think that the streets that to me seem the most beautiful in New York are the ones that it doesn't get on the list unless there's a falling down building in it somewhere. And I don't mean that just like totally in this aesthetic way, but I think there is something about just sort of a decaying part of the city that makes it, I don't know, more alive or something like that. In Harlem, I don't know. I remember always thinking that there was just something in the pavement there, some story just ingrained into the sidewalks and the buildings themselves. I remember there's the Schomburg Center, which is a library focusing on Black history, sort of a museum. But really, the whole neighborhood is a museum in some sense, with stories burnt into every single corner. I remember when I was in Nicaragua, like I mentioned, one place we visited was called the Museum of Traditions and Legends. This was set up as part of some tour that I went on, and it was an interesting place. It had been once a prison during the Somoza regime, and it was a place where people had been tortured and, imprisoned for long, long periods of time with no hope, essentially. And in this museum, they built all these sort of uncanny paper mache. I don't mean to get too sidetracked, but they built all these sort of weird paper mache like dolls all over the place. It was kind of spooky, but I remember on the tour, I was there with one person. Well, one person who was there with me was somebody, it was a family friend I knew growing up who's an author, and he couldn't do the tour. Like, he didn't want to see these things. He was overwhelmed by the sort of suffering that was still resonating within the walls, right? And he was out by one of these fountains, and he's like, yeah, they like drowned people in this fountain. And I don't know, I mentioned this just because I feel like in some ways there was a similar. I remember thinking a similar thing at sometimes living in Harlem, that there were so many ghosts wandering around in some ways. Certainly, my time there was not all great. It's a complicated place to live. It was a complicated place to live. And I mean, my number one piece of advice for anybody who's actually thinking about moving to Harlem is that it is not a neighborhood that you move to without expecting some interesting stuff to happen. And I don't mean interesting in a good way or interesting in a bad way, really, but it's not some inert place. It's not some suburban place where you just slot yourself in and nothing's going to happen. You don't need to think about it. It's a complicated place, right? I remember when I went to stores, I think the rule of thumb was that people, not just in stores, but in general, people would either be very nice to me or very rude to me. There was a time when I would go to Whole Foods sometimes, at Whole Foods in Harlem. I didn't go there for long, don't worry. But I remember going there sometimes, and once I was there, and the cashier would not bag my groceries. And I waited a little bit longer, and she bagged the next person's groceries. And I mean, usually that's what people would do at that store. Other times they would do that, but one time a woman just wouldn't do that for me. Nothing was said exactly. It was always seemed a little weird that there was a Whole Foods in Harlem. Now apparently there's also a Trader Joe's. I don't know. I haven't lived there for a couple of years, but apparently there's a Trader Joe's quite near that Whole Foods. I remember walking home. I felt conspicuous about going to the Whole Foods, which I mean, again, it's like, you know, there will be complications here. I felt conspicuous about doing a lot of things. I felt conspicuous about going to the Whole Foods, and I made sure to get my own grocery bags. I remember coming back like once or twice from Whole Foods before I had them, and one time a guy like stopped me on the street and was like, "Yeah, get out of here." I forget exactly how he addressed me, but he, in no uncertain terms, told me I was unwelcome in the neighborhood. I later would shop at this place called Green Olive Market, which was sort of a local grocery store, a hole-in-the-wall grocery store that had really an odd selection of food, like cassava and all this interesting stuff. In one corner of the store, the floor vibrated somewhat violently. And one day, the coolers were broken. All the food was like out and going bad. Actually, the coolers broke a lot. At one point, the store was closed a little bit, and they're saying, "Oh, we're remodeling. We'll be open a little bit. We'll be open soon," right? And they were closed for like 5 months, whatever. I'm pretty sure that this business was maybe laundering money. I don't know how the heck they stayed in business given how much they were closed. But it was a nice little hole in the wall. I had to go back to Whole Foods at that time, which again I didn't totally enjoy. There was animosity, certainly. When I lived there, times I'd be walking down the street and you'd walk by somebody, and right after you pass them, they'd spit. Times where people would, again, just tell you to your face that you should not live there. The homeless population is also a huge, huge piece of living in Harlem. In fact, that's maybe one of the defining things about my time there. If you just visit New York and you visit Midtown or whatever, you will see homeless people, but you're going to see tourist-friendly homeless people. You're going to see the people in Bryant Park who will have sort of a quirky interaction with you, and then you'll give them your food or something like that. In Harlem, it's different. You'll see people who are really very visibly, under the influence of something, I guess. I was such a sheltered child growing up. I remember moving to Harlem. I didn't even know what drugs people were doing. I didn't even know what drugs would result in the sort of things that I saw. It was normal for me to enter my apartment or to leave it to have to step over somebody, It's very common to walk down the street and see people just like lying on the ground, and you don't know if this person is all right. My first instinct when I moved there was, should I do something? Is this person okay? You have to sort of let go of that impulse, because you'll see that every single time that you walk down 125th, people who could be dead. They probably aren't, but you don't know. Over time, you'll realize that these people are actually there a lot. You sort of get to know them. I mean, you don't really get to know them exactly, but you see the same faces again and again. I remember a couple of people who stuck out in particular. There's a guy who used a wheelchair, and it was never clear exactly to me if he actually needed the wheelchair or if this was part of his shtick for getting money, but he would wheel out into the road into 125th and sort of go up to cars' windows as they were waiting for the light and like tap on the window and try and get money or something like that. I remember seeing him one night, just looking out the window and seeing him like wheeling around in the middle of 125th in the middle of the night. And I wondered to myself, like, is he trying to get hit by a car? And you don't know. I remember there's a woman there, probably the number one, like, yeah, the person was sort of most vividly in my mind from that time period was a woman, and she had some sort of substance abuse problem. I don't really know what. Very commonly, she would just sort of be asleep on the street. But I remember sometimes I'd be walking down the street and I would see her ringing the doorbells, like the electronic doorbell things, ringing the doorbell for each building, and then like shouting into it or something like that. And I just remember wondering, like, what does she think this is? Like, what is her conception of this thing? Like, what world is she in right now? Don't know. You would see these guys quite a bit, and they'd usually, camp out on one corner or whatever, and they'd be there for a couple weeks, and then the NYPD would come and they'd put up some lights on this corner, and then the people would move, and they'd be around the corner, and then they'd put up some lights there eventually, and they'd come to some other place, and they'd just sort of cycle around. Of course, there are a lot of shelters in the area. I never really understood exactly the dynamics of this, but you walk past some shelters that were in Harlem, and then, of course, a lot of people would cross over the bridge to Randall's Island as well. Again, like I said, I don't really understand all the dynamics of this. Panhandling, of course, was commonplace. I mean, I was probably asked for money maybe once a day, maybe every other day or something like that, which I didn't really mind. I made sure to always engage with people. I felt like it was important to me to always acknowledge people's humanity or whatever. So you always say hi or something like that. I remember thinking at one point, trying to figure out, because it's not easy to have a sincere interaction with a homeless person, with somebody whose life is just so different. It's hard to understand how to do that. I've been with people sometimes who have interacted with them in a way that I feel like is very patronizing or insincere or just not the way. So I struggled with this a little bit. At one point, I became convinced that the best thing that you could say was "God bless you." I'm not religious, but I thought that's one thing that people are pretty likely to think is sincere. I don't know. So I would say things like that for a while. I had a policy where if I had money and somebody asked me for some money, I would usually give it to them. In fact, I would always give it to them if I had money, which meant I didn't have cash very often. And it didn't matter what the reason was or what the excuse was. And I remember during the pandemic once, some guy coming up to me, he sort of stumbled up to me and he said, "I have the coronavirus." And he pulled out some piece of paper that was like, "See this? It's the doctor's thing." And he was waving it around. I couldn't really read it. It wasn't from a doctor. And he said, "I have the coronavirus, and my daughter needs money to get her uniform for school, and my wife is sick," changing the story a whole bunch. And he seemed just really fidgety. And I had money, so I gave it to him, And I mean, obviously, I don't think he was telling the truth. I don't know what he wanted it for. Potentially to use it for drugs? I don't know. I would tell people, I hope you find what you need. This is a policy that a lot of people, I think, would maybe disagree with. I mean, I don't know. People say you should, if you're donating money, you should donate it to an organization that knows what they're doing, and that giving money to people directly is a big mistake. But I also think a lot of people who say that aren't. I don't know. I think some people say that strategically. I think there's a lot of different reasons why people say that, and for some of them, it's just about the intellectual higher ground. There's don't give it to people, give it to orgs, right? They just want to seem smart or whatever. There's some people who just don't want to talk to the homeless. I think that's probably the most common thing. It's like, oh no, give it to the food bank, and then they're not actually going to donate their money to the food bank. Really, they're just saying this because they don't want to talk to a homeless person, right? So I made this sort of policy when I first moved there, and I stuck with it the entire time. And I gave money to some people that definitely were lying to me and were not on the level. I think the only time where I stopped in my tracks was a guy who came up to me and told me, "Oh, it's my birthday today," and it was the day after my birthday. I think he told me my 23rd birthday, my 22nd birthday, something like that. A kid, And this guy comes up to me, and I mean, he seemed like an intelligent guy, but he's optimizing for a fix in the way that many people do in these situations or whatever. And he's telling me, oh, it's my birthday, all this stuff, and I had cash. I was like, yeah, sure, but he wanted me to buy him cigarettes, and couldn't do that. I remember a guy wanted me to buy him a watermelon at one point, and I was going to, but I didn't have any cash. They only took cash. I was like, sorry, man, I gotta get places. But anyway, panhandling was obviously a huge part of living there. The place in general was extremely loud. I lived on 125th. I slept with the window open. I don't know how I did this in hindsight. Because 125th is like, it's on the ambulance path to somewhere. I don't know where, some hospital. And I'd sleep with the window open. I don't know how I did this. It was loud, and it's an abrasive place. When I would step out the door to go someplace, I'd find myself bracing before stepping outside, right? Find myself just tensing up a little bit before I stepped outside. Ultimately, that's one of the reasons that I moved. I didn't know anybody in Harlem, and this, I think, was another one of the things that was tough about living there. In New York, you have to know somebody, really, to do a lot of things. You can find anything in New York, but you have to know somebody, usually. I mean, a good example is that Thomas Jefferson Park where the basketball stuff was, there was also a soccer league that played there. I play soccer. I like soccer a lot. But you go and you watch these games, and it's like, it's the Colombians playing the Kenyans, right? And it's like, well, I don't think that's a league that I really could play in, or like, how would I go about this? No idea, right? In my life, I am typically a chronic outsider. I don't mind being an outsider at all. In fact, I kind of like floating around and just wandering through the world and seeing what people are up to. But being in Harlem takes that to another level, because it's very common to look around and not see another white person anywhere, right? In a 360-degree view, where you can see 300 people or whatever on some busy corner or whatever. Maybe it's a little bit different now. I don't know. It's a couple years ago. But that was more sort of extreme. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, maybe that made it for me easier. Maybe it made it harder for me because I was less inclined to sort of reach out to other people. I don't know. It's a tricky question to think about how my life was shaped by this time. Anyway, one of the main questions, of course, that everybody thinks about, everybody asks, everybody wants to know is it safe? Or some people, they want to know, is it dangerous? Right? I don't know, is the short answer. I remember when I first moved there, I had the Citizen app, which is an app that will tell you about a bunch of crimes that are happening. And I remember once, you get a notification on the app that says, oh, there's a knife fight on the corner of 125th and Park. I'm like, I live on 125th and Park. I look out the window, and it's like, oh yeah, there's two guys going at it. And then you see the NYPD like roll up with like 20 cars or whatever. People say what you want about the NYPD, but they do respond quickly and in force, right? I ended up deleting the Citizen app because it was in my mind too much, I think. And that's an interesting lesson about safety, about what it really means to be safe. Obviously, to a large extent, it is about your state of mind. That said, I mean, there is concrete stuff in terms of crimes that happen. There was a shooting across the street from my apartment at one point. I was home. I didn't notice it. I remember I was doing some working from home at this point during the pandemic. I looked out the window, and there were a ton of cops down there standing around, and an ambulance was sort of pulling away. And I think there was sort of a red splotch down on the pavement or whatever, which I don't know what it was. It's someone dropped their beats there and stained the sidewalk or something. I don't know. But I thought, weird, did something happen? And like half an hour later, I got a knock on my door, and it was NYPD detective. And he was like, oh yeah, did you see anything? I was like, nope. Which, that was the moment where I felt like, you've become a New Yorker. There was a shooting across the street, and you didn't notice. Would I have told him anything had I seen anything? I don't know. Very interesting interaction. I asked him. He said, yeah, the crime is worse now than it has been in a long time. He said it's not since the 1970s that it was this bad. And this is maybe even worse. I said, why do you think that is? And I don't remember what he said, but it was an interesting answer. I could tell this detective, NYPD detective, was quite a character. I remember, I don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty about safety. Sometimes you're walking down the street and you see like up in front of you, a big group of like people in front of one building, and you think, should I cross the street? I could go sort of through this group, but I don't know. They're taking up a lot of space, right? Maybe I should cross. And you'd get up to there, and it'd be like a family hanging out on the stoop, totally innocuous. Or other times you get up there, and you wouldn't cross. It'd be a bunch of high schoolers, and they would be taking up a bunch of space. And it would feel really, not exactly unsafe, but it would feel weird to go through the middle of it. Should you go out at night? This is another question, I don't know. I can't tell you. What I know is that when I lived there, I did plan out my routes a little bit. I knew that there were certain blocks that were worse than others. There were places that I avoided. And so I would sort of weave my way around. But I don't think I was really afraid anyway. But look, I never knew the answers to any of those questions. And so if you're looking for a place where you definitively are like, yeah, this is safe, might not be the place. But I can't answer the question how safe it is. I think when I lived there, I got a lot of practice at looking confident but non-confrontational, which is the key, I think, maybe, I don't know, for going through these places. Look like you belong, but don't look like you want to confront anybody or talk to anyone. And I never really had any major issues. I mean, look, I mentioned that people spit near me a couple times. That's not really a major altercation. There were things, I don't know, there were, like I said, this question of space, taking up space, was something I thought about a lot, because, of course, I wondered often, should I be here? And living in Harlem, I think, really sharpened my sensitivity to taking up space. Now, it's not something that it was alien to me at any point, but like I said, you really get the feeling of like, oh, there's a bunch of high schoolers hanging out on this whole sidewalk. I can't really weave through them. And maybe they're just, sort of boisterous in a way that's, nothing against this. It's cool to be in high school and hang out with your friends. But sometimes you don't realize, like, just how much you are territorializing a public area, which, I mean, maybe you do realize. Maybe that's the point, right? Sometimes you'd be walking down the street and there'd be two guys, like, passing a basketball across the sidewalk between each other. And you'd be like, yeah, I gotta go this way. Not a big deal, but like I said, space. In terms of taking up space, for me, I was, I think, kind of a ghost when I lived there. I had a small footprint. I didn't talk to anybody, didn't make much noise. I don't know. A lot of these things tee into political questions a little bit. I mean, it's hard to answer the question, like, should I be there, without relying on some underlying political ideas, I guess. And this is a complicated thing. It's easy to it's very tempting to want to lump Harlem into, I don't know, I guess into it's easy to make some assumptions about the politics there that are totally wrong. And I guess what these would typically look like is that it's easy to assume that people are going to be more progressive than they actually are, right? I remember I lived in a building that we didn't really have a doorman, but there was a security guy who'd be there sometimes. I guess he was sort of a security guy, but I mean, he was very small. I don't know who he would be protecting us from, but he was a very interesting guy. He was an immigrant from Haiti, and he told me that he'd worked on like the Haitian nuclear program or something, and they'd come to the U.S. and become a professor, but that now he was like, I don't know how he ended up working as a night watchman or whatever. Very odd guy. Every time I would come down, he'd be listening like loudly on his phone to like Sean Hannity or some like Fox News thing. He would tell me that I talked to this guy some. He had a way of pulling you into a conversation. Sometimes when you really need to get somewhere. Very, very interesting guy. He would tell me, for instance, that the Democrats would, when it was election season, they'd come to Harlem and they'd pick up all the homeless people and they'd put them on a bus to the polling station and force them to vote or whatever. Of course, voting isn't exactly a bad thing. So, look, I don't know. The politics there are complicated, I guess. It's hard for me to get into it more deeply than that. Some of the political differences became really clear during the pandemic. So yeah, I lived in Harlem during the COVID-19 pandemic. I lived in the zip code 135, where 1 out of 2 people got COVID, and 1 out of 124 people died from COVID. One of the neighborhoods that was hit the hardest in New York City, and in a cruel irony, it was a neighborhood that, while being hit the hardest, had the fewest precautions, right? It was night and day. Sometimes I'd walk. I stopped taking the train for like 6 months during the pandemic. Sometimes I would walk down into some other neighborhood, Upper West Side, Upper East Side, even in the Midtown a couple times, and completely different scenario than in Harlem. I remember hearing, apparently in the beginning, people thought that you couldn't get the coronavirus if you were black. There were lots of people out and about, right? You'd go to Randall's Island sometimes, and there'd be like huge like picnics. Now, granted, this was outdoors, but still like huge gatherings of people throughout all stages of the pandemic. Morningside Park, on the other side of Harlem, same thing, exactly. Night and day difference between how people would deal with this in different neighborhoods. And like I said, it was cruel because this was a neighborhood where a lot of people would die. This alludes a little bit to a political question, the relationship between the government and the people. I think maybe when some people see like a sign posted on the street, they have a conception of like, oh, yeah, the government, there was some sign put up here for some reason. They have a conception of this relationship between you and them. And in Harlem, that relationship is just completely different. And I don't blame people for being skeptical, at the very least, of the government. And it's not to say that there's no organization. There are alternative things that spring up, like churches, I guess. I'm not going to try to analyze this too deeply, but like I said, it was very different. People's response. Clearly, when the pandemic was kicking off, things were not great. I mean, I remember in the early days, I was taking the Metro North out to work, and you go to work, you'd be in the cafeteria, and you'd think like, well, if the coronavirus comes to the U.S., it's going to get to New York, and there'd be somebody at the table next to you like coughing their lungs out, right? And most likely, it was already there. But I think the first coronavirus outbreaks that we're talking about in New York were along the Metro North train line. Different line. I think it was the line that goes out to Connecticut, whatever that was called. Yeah, we eventually got sent home. I remember on a Monday, I went to work on a Monday, and I was complaining to some colleague I was taking the train with back. I said, oh, they're being so slow to act. We should be being remote. All other big tech companies are already doing it, but we're not. And then that night we got an email that was like, don't come back, basically. And I thought, thank goodness I brought my charger home. I knew people who like didn't do that. And the protocol you had to go through to get stuff from the office after that was crazy. Like, pull up in your car, do not get out, like make this hand signal, someone will come out, knock 3 times on the window, people taking precautions, people being very stringent, completely the opposite of what I was seeing in Harlem. Clearly, though, I mean, it's not like life was just continuing normally. Clearly, things were different. I remember the first time that I really thought, we might be in trouble here, was when there was a line outside of the Whole Foods. People lined up, spaced out to get their groceries. And I thought, this seems like a movie about the apocalypse. That's not so great. I remember thinking, is it always going to be safe for me to get groceries on 125th? Right? Will there be shortages? Will there be such extreme shortages? I remember wondering, what happens if the trains stop running? Right? Could you imagine that? The train stopped running? Like I said, I stopped taking the train for 6 months. That's hard to even believe, being in New York. How could you not take the subway for 6 months? Well, because there was nothing happening. There was no place to go, right? And you were scared to do anything and go anywhere. I do remember passing over one of the subway gratings 5 months into this and smelling the subway and just feeling this rush of emotion, being so nostalgic for the smell of the subway. These were wild times. What can I say? There were more and more ambulances going by this time. Like I said, I lived on the ambulance route. You heard it more and more. There was one building in particular, a couple blocks away, a couple blocks down. I'd see ambulances pulling in all the time, and I wonder what's going on. What's up with this place? I walked past it one day, and it was a hospice center. Well, it wasn't a hospice center. It was a retirement home, I think. That was another thing about Harlem that I wasn't as familiar with. There were a bunch of the something or other houses, which looked a little bit like projects, but they were actually sort of retirement homes for poor people, or a lot of drug rehab clinics or whatever, the something or other houses. I wasn't really familiar at all with that sort of thing. But yeah, there'd be ambulances coming to those places all the time. You would read, you'd see in the New York Times, oh, they're starting to use morgue trucks in some places because There's too many people dying to, you know, to process everybody. And you'd walk down the street and you'd see one, right? You'd go past a hospital and there'd be this big like trailer behind it, and there'd be like a little tented area that comes sort of out to it. You know, you would read articles about like, wow, this hospital is getting like absolutely slammed, and you realize, you know, that's 1 mile from my apartment, and you'd read stories about people there just like dying on the floor of the hospital, and you'd think, yeah, that's my neighborhood. You would see the homeless people start to be affected. You'd see them coughing, and then you just wouldn't see some of them again or something like that, you know? Then there was the rumor that somebody in my building had it. There was a couple of units in my building that I think were subsidized housing, and there was an old woman in a walker who was always there, and she didn't see her again. This whole thing heightened my heightened so many questions about living in this place, so many of the tensions and so many of the uncertainties about living there were multiplied by the pandemic. And the best example I can possibly give you is that one day I was walking down the street. I guess this was at my second apartment because this was near Thomas Jefferson Park. There's, you know, along the river there's a little walkway. There's a path along the river you can go on, but you got to go over the road, over the highway to get there. And you, so there's a little footbridge over the FDR. And I remember one day just going for a walk and going over this footbridge. And when I I got to the top of the footbridge and I saw that on the ramp down on the other side, there was a woman who was sort of on the ground. And I got closer to her, and that she had a walker that was there. And then maybe 3 or 4 feet from the walker was this woman on the ground, sort of kind of getting up on a little bit, like starting to get up on her hands or whatever. And this was in the absolute height of the pandemic, a time when people were afraid to do anything, where people were afraid to get near one another. And you think, well, what should I do? This is a woman who looks like she's probably homeless, very likely to have come in contact with the coronavirus recently, but she's down on the ground and she's like needs help to get back up or something like that. And you just think, man, what am I supposed to do? And yeah, I mean, I don't think I handled the situation very well, to be honest. I went and I tried to help her up. And, you know, I was living, one thing about the time, this interesting perk of living on my own at the time was that I wasn't as worried about getting other people sick. I was worried about getting sick myself, but I thought, well, and I was really worried about getting seriously sick and not having anyone to take care of me. A lot of my friends had left the city, right? They'd started going back to their homes. I remember first your friends who live in Princeton, New Jersey, they go home, right? Dad brings a station wagon up and you just hop in and go home. Then my friend who lives in Amherst, Massachusetts, he went home. Okay. Then my friend who lived in India went home, and I thought, uh-oh. Hey, he didn't go home, actually. He went to live with his uncles in North Carolina or something like that. But, you know, you think, yikes. And before long, I felt like I was the only person in the city, or just me and this woman, right, with the walker. And, I tried to help her up. I couldn't lift her. You know, you underestimate how heavy people are when they're not under their own power. It seemed like she wanted help up, but she wasn't very communicative. I mean, she seemed like she was asking for help up, but when I went to lift her up, it was like she didn't want to be lifted or something. So I sort of got her up a little bit, like sort of onto the seat of her walker, and she kind of slumped back down and then kind of fell back to the ground a little bit more. Not exactly fell, but sort of slouched back onto the ground. And I just thought, man, I have no idea what to do. And eventually, a couple of people came by and just walked past. Eventually, there was a guy in a like mobility scooter, and he came over the overpass. Black guy came. I talked to him a little bit, and he was like, "Okay." I thought about calling the police, but this was a time when you thought, "Oh, don't do that," right? This was during or just after the apex of the Black Lives Matter protests, which were also extremely visible in Harlem and elsewhere, this guy said, okay, I just saw there were some cops in the park right there. I'll go back over and I'll go talk to them. And I was like, yeah, okay. And he did that. And the police came, and I stayed with this woman a little bit. I tried to talk to her, and she wasn't very verbal. I couldn't really talk to her. The police came, and I talked to them for like a second, and then they got to work. And I started to walk off, and I just remember turning back and looking at these two cops, and they put on their gloves. They put on these, like, medical gloves in a way that seems so sort of impersonal. I mean, in a way that seems like, of course, duh, put on gloves. And I thought, man, what a fool I was, because I didn't do it. I didn't do anything right here, because I came in contact directly with this woman, but I also didn't help her, right? Okay, the cops came and they put on these gloves, which seemed wise, but again, also impersonal. And they didn't approach her really, but they said, at a distance, one of them sort of spoke up in this like almost customer service voice, like the elder care voice, like, so you've had a little fall or something like that. I forget exactly what they said, but something sort of like, I don't know, this disingenuous like elder care thing. And I walked away, and I just remember thinking that, the whole thing, I just had no idea what to do in that sort of situation. There were more extreme things that happened too. I remember one day I was coming down Frederick Douglass Boulevard. I was going north on it around 113th, I think, something like that. And I was coming up. Yeah, I was coming up, and I saw that on the street in front of me, there were a bunch of like cops and like an ambulance parked. So something was going on there. And again, living there, you often have these questions. Do I turn? Do I cross the street? Do I go some other place? And I was like, nah, I'm going through. I've lived here for a while. There's no problem. As I got a little bit closer, I could see that there was somebody on the ground on the corner near the door of a business. And they had some sort of bag like over their face. They had something over their mouth. Not a mask exactly, but some sort of like bag or something like that. And they were down on the ground, not moving at all. And none of these workers were doing anything. None of them were approaching the guy. They were standing back. And a couple of them looked at me as I was sort of just walking by, and were like, why are you going through here? And you don't know what these situations happens here. You don't know what's happened. But the first thing that entered my mind was, oh, this guy died, like probably from the coronavirus, and probably in the last 5 minutes. Because it seemed like everybody had just taken a step back and had given up or something like that. And I thought, dang, I should have turned, because that kind of thing lasts in your mind. And that was not the only time that I saw something like that. I remember later walking down, I guess this was 122nd Street, and this was on the other side of the street from me. I was just coming down, and there was a guy. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but he was sort of in between two cars. There was, across the street from me, there were two cars parked like this, and the guy was kind of under one of them and kind of hanging onto the back bumper of another one and coughing just like a lot. And there was another guy with him who was looking at him in a way like I don't know what to do, like yikes or something. And this guy was just like coughing his lungs out. And I don't know why I got the feeling, but as I was walking by, I didn't really stop. I only looked at it for a few seconds, but I just had the deepest sense that the guy was dying, like in the process of dying. I don't know. It's, in some ways, it seems almost ridiculous recounting these things. Like, wow, like you traumatized yourself completely living there or something like that. I don't know. Certainly, there were a lot of big experiences during this time. And partly, I'm conflating two things a little bit here. Obviously, the pandemic was a traumatic time. It was, inherently. Lots of people died during this thing. There's no way to sweep that under the rug. Also, living in Harlem is a complicated place. Bringing those two things together was, I don't know. It was interesting. There was one experience that summed up this entire thing, I think. There's one thing that I think back to every time that I think about living in Harlem. It was earlier in the pandemic. It was before either of those two things had happened. And I was walking, I don't remember where I was going, but I was going down the street, and I think this was on the corner of Malcolm X and 125th. And there was a preacher on the street there. Fairly common for people to be preaching in Harlem. I remember in the subway station, the 456 stop on 125th and Lex, there would be a couple there. I don't know if they were a couple, but there'd be two people, a man and a woman, who would preach bilingually. And the man would say something in English and then the woman would say something in Spanish so passionately. And, again, I'm not religious, but I remember thinking it was pretty powerful. There was also a branch of the Church of Scientology in Harlem on 125th. There were a lot of interesting churches around. Sometimes you'd peek in the door and you'd see just people singing inside. And it was moving. Again, an experience that I felt like I had no way of participating in any sense, but, sort of moving. Anyway, there was this guy preaching on the corner, and for whatever reason, this day felt like more apocalyptic than some of the other days in the pandemic. This was pretty early on, and it's like you walked around and you could tell that people those like hushed voices. You could tell that it was like bad news. Like everybody just heard something bad, or like everybody was worried. Everybody was scared. Let me put it that way. It felt like you were in some sort of movie. It felt like everybody was scared. And on the corner, there was this guy preaching, and I remember so vividly, he said, some people, when they think about Harlem, they think about crime. They think about lawlessness. They think about homelessness. They think about poverty. And he said, but the Bible says where sin abounds, grace abounds much more. And for whatever reason, that moment and that phrase, I had to walk away. I left because I became emotional hearing him just say that. So I didn't stick around. But that snippet, that phrase, is what I think back to. Is what I think back to with living there. Anyway, I moved from Harlem in the end because it was too far north. That was really the only reason. I moved from my first apartment because it was during the pandemic and the landlord wanted to raise my rent. And I liked my first apartment. I was thinking about maybe moving to another unit in the building or something like that. I was looking at the website for the building, and I saw that there were amazing deals on the other units. Units just like mine, renting for like nothing, right? And meanwhile, they were trying to raise my rent. I said, if I'm not going to pay you more than you'd be renting this for if you put it back on the market tomorrow, right? And they were trying to screw me over. They were trying to run the clock down. So with like 4 days left on my lease, I said, see ya, and I found another apartment. And I moved further east, in East Harlem, which is a different kettle of fish entirely, much more Hispanic neighborhood. I've conflated these neighborhoods a little bit in the stories, but really they're very different places. Anyway, I lived in East Harlem, right across the street from Costco. Great place, really a beautiful neighborhood. I lived on Pleasant Avenue. I remember having walked down Pleasant Avenue one time and thinking, the first time I was there, actually, I thought, wow, this is a nice little street. What's it called? And I looked at it, and it was Pleasant Avenue. And I thought, wow, this is a place that's so far east that it foregoes the whole, it'd be 0th Avenue. So it's sort of akin to like Sutton Place, where there's extra avenues that are less than First Avenue. Anyway, beautiful, beautiful place. Really enjoyed my time there. But it was a 15-minute walk to a local stop on the 6th, right, at 116th. And that was kind of the death knell. I mean, really, that was the main issue with living in Harlem, was just that it was too far away from other stuff. It was too far north. It's a hard question for me to know if about this time. Obviously, I don't regret living there at all, but realistically, I would have had other interesting experiences had I lived some other place. And I do think that there were some trade-offs that I made, particularly in not living with other people. Like if I had moved in with some of my college friends and lived in a different place and had a longer commute, but lived with people that I knew, it would have been a very different 2 years after college. And it's impossible to know exactly how that would have compared, but I don't think it would have necessarily, I don't know. Like I said, I don't regret it, but there are other ways that I could use my time that would have also been good. I don't think that anything else would have given me such a profound experience in some way. I don't know. Anyway, so look, I think you get the idea. I don't have a lot of answers for anybody who's trying to figure out if they want to move there. The only thing I would say is that it's not a simple place to live. In some ways, it is a great place, but in some ways, it's a big can of worms. What can I say? So that was my time. That was my time in Harlem.